Okay, thank you very much, Garrett, for this really kind introduction, and thanks so much for the invitation to talk with you about a subject that really interests me at the moment, the twin transition. Garrett already briefly introduced the topic. It's really a topic that has great interest in the European Union. It's about connecting the digital transition, the idea that the use of new technologies is transforming our societies, but also transforming our forms of governance, and the sustainability transition, the idea that we really need to start working in different ways, transporting ourselves in different ways, produce energy in different ways to make sure that we will save the planet. So these are two huge questions, and in this presentation I will make it even more complicated because I will discuss how these two questions can be connected. Um, Garrett already briefly introduced me. I'm a professor of public management at Utrecht University. I work at the Utrecht University School of Governance. It's a really nice school with a group of about 100 colleagues working on different aspects of governance and public management. Um, we have quite a strong group of people working on digitalization in the public sector, and we're involved in various research projects. And I'll tell you more about one of the important research projects at the moment, which is about the twin transition. Um, yeah, as Garrett said, we'll take the questions in the end. So if you already want to ask something during the presentation, you can already put your question in the chat, and then at the end I'll also start looking at the questions in the chat, or you can just ask the question by raising your hand as Gerhard indicated. Um, but let me start by briefly introducing the project that this research is based on. It's called the PATS project, the Public Administration Capabilities for Digital and Sustainable Transition. It's a twinning project, as it's called in the European Union. It's about exchanging knowledge on research, teaching, and administration, all connected to this main challenge of the twin transition. And I work with partners from Tallinn University of Technology. Feiko Lemmer, who many of you may know, is the project leader, so he's in the lead of this project. And then Joep Kromvoets from Leuven and his team are involved. Rainer Kattel and people from University College London are involved. And I work with two colleagues, Emma Pullen and Erna Rijer here at Utrecht University on this project. So this is an ongoing project and with a strong focus on the twin transition. Um, so what is the twin transition? Yeah, I think this slide really summarizes the core idea. The idea is that there's two big transitions going on, where we need to generate our energy in different ways. We need to have more circular economies. We need to protect nature. We need to produce energy in different ways. We need different forms of mobility. So this is all related to this sustainability transition, which is in the newspapers every day, which, well, at least in the Dutch elections, is still not receiving enough attention. But I think everybody now agrees that this is one of the main challenges for humanity actually at the moment. The other transition is the digital transition. I know many of you are working in this field. The digital transition is really the idea that new technologies. So the latest one is is artificial intelligence, such as ChatGPT. But we've had a whole wave of other technologies, such as big data, such as social media, such as internet technologies, such as the blockchain, etc. And all these technologies are transforming our modes of interaction. Therefore, for example, we can do this lecture online. I can connect with you over the internet, but it's also transforming how we connect to friends, how we do business. but also how government performs, how government is organized. And yeah, we have many projects on algorithmization in the public sector, for example, in the police and in healthcare. And we really see that the organization of the police, the organization of healthcare organizations is transforming through the use of these new technologies. What we're seeing, however, is that both in literature, as already mentioned by Gerhard, but also in practice, these are largely two unconnected fields of development. Many people that work on on the sustainability transition have actually developed very few ideas about how this needs or can be facilitated by the digital transition. And on the other hand, people working on the digital transition very strongly focus on performance, efficiency, client orientation, governance, etc. But there's very limited attention actually for the question to what extent the digital transition will actually contribute to the sustainability transition. So yeah, what's called the sweet spot in this figure is where the digital transition actually helps to realize the sustainability transition. And in Europe, this is called towards a green and digital future. The two can be connected to ensure that the digital transformation actually helps us to deal with the sustainability challenge. So that's the main argument at a policy level. Um, and I'll give you some examples to make this more concrete. And the first example is the circular economy. Um, Many governments, national governments, but also local governments, emphasize the need to reduce the use of resources, to reuse resources, to recycle resources. So it's really important to have this circular economy where we do not produce waste all the time, but reuse the waste and recycle it to make sure that our usage of resources is limited. When the city of Utrecht, the city government has formulated the ambition to become fully circular, to become a circular city, and that means, for example, to ensure that the way waste is processed is done in such a way that the waste can be reused, that wastewater is used, for example, to generate energy or to generate heat. And that, for example, building materials that are now used to, for example, position seats in benches in public parks, that the material that is used there now will be recycled when it's not useful anymore. Um, so this is the promise of the circular economy, but realizing this promise is incredibly difficult actually, because it means that we have to keep track of all these resources. We have to have a good overview of how all the building materials are used, how the wastewater is processed, how the other waste is being processed. So there's a huge information challenge. There needs to be data about all these streams of resources, about all these objects. These data need to be processed and combined to be able to see to what extent the promise of the circular city is already being realized, and what needs to be done to ensure that this promise can be realized. So the city of Utrecht is now working on setting up a data and information system to keep track of all the resources. They're developing dashboards to ensure that they can provide this information in a useful manner, so that the digital transformation, the use of all this information, can be connected to the ambition of creating a circular city. So that's the first example. Second example is the energy transition. This is an example that comes from Portugal. And here the idea is really that we're moving towards different forms of producing energy. For example, by having consumers putting solar panels on their roofs, by changing electricity regulations so that the consumers can also give energy to our grids so that it can be used by other people. So we go to a distributed form of energy production. This is all very promising and important in reducing the CO2 emission connected to our electricity system, but it also raises all kinds of information challenges to ensure that we know where and when, what kind of energy is being produced, how this can be distributed, how the costs can be calculated, how the money for the energy that's being produced can be given to the people that produce the energy. So again, there's a huge information infrastructure needed to support this new type of electricity infrastructure. And I'll give you a final example, and that's about mobility. Again, an example from the Netherlands about mobility as a service. You may be familiar with the idea. The idea is really that um, that now everybody wants to own a car, and then car ownership is really high because people will want to have the option to go from A to B with their own car. This does result in a huge CO2 emission. So the Ministry of Infrastructure in the Netherlands has a policy for stimulating mobility as a service, where people have a sort of a chain of options, going by train and then by bicycle, maybe do some car sharing to go from A to B, so that they don't have to use their own car, but can use a combination of different modes of transport to go from their homes to work or to another place. Um, Again, as you may realize, this really contributes to reducing the CO2 emission, but also raises the question how this can all be managed. And this requires that individual people have an app that they can use to arrange mobility as a service, that all the mobility providers share information so that it can be used for the app, that there are good ways to share information about usage, so that the financial consequences of the mobility as a service can be arranged well. So again, we see that sort of this big sustainability ambition needs to be accompanied by a good information infrastructure that enables this to be realized. So this is the big idea of the twin transition, and these are some concrete examples to show how governments are already working on this and what the challenges are that they're facing. So what I want to do in this presentation is basically two things. Um, the first thing is more sort of an instrumental analysis. And here I want to sort of focus on what governments need to do to make the twin transition work. And more specifically, this analysis focuses on the government capacities that we need to enable governments to work on this twin transition. Um, so that's the sort of more instrumental question, where we as researchers try to produce the knowledge that can help governments to build up the capacities that they need. Um, the second one is a more critical reflection. What we do in the second paper is that we reflect on the assumptions that are underlying this idea of the twin transition, and the assumptions about the relation between the digital and sustainability transitions. And what we aim to do is to sort of challenge some of these assumptions, and also uncover questions that may not be asked related to this assumption about the connection of the digital and sustainability transition. Um, so these two storylines are actually really connected to how I see my work as a researcher. On the one hand, I find it important to produce knowledge that is useful for society to tackle some of the main challenges that we're facing right now. But at the same time, as a researcher, I also see it as my task to be critical about the assumptions that are now underlying certain policy plans. So I see this as a researcher being a critical friend, where we try to help governments and help society at large to proceed and to deal with problems, but at the same time also be critical about some of the assumptions that are underlying current courses of action. Okay, let me start with the first storyline, the capacities, and this is based on work in progress. We already presented a first version of our paper at the ECPA conference, the Conference of the European Group for Public Administration. And what we do in this paper, we sort of bring together literature from a whole bunch of different streams of literature. Um, it's literature on the sustainability transition, on the digital transition, and on the twin transition. And we sort of analyze all this literature to develop a first initial explorative understanding of what kind of capacities are needed for governments that want to realize the twin transition, that want to be able to work on this energy transition, or work on the circular city, or work on mobility as a service. What does that require from governments? What capacities do they need to have to be able to realize this? Um, and we do that by developing a multi-level model of capacities, and I do admit it's really ambitious, in the sense that we really want to um, indicate what these capacities are at the national level, at the level of organizations, and at the individual level, so that we sort of highlight what is needed to make the twin transition work. And so if I start with the macro level, then it's about the what we call the institutional position of government and legitimizing support to fulfill societal expectations. Um, and what you can think of, for example, is that governments need to have the policy capacity to work on long-term commitments. And often governments work on plans that are related to the electoral cycle. So there's a government plan to work on certain ambitions within a period of 4 years. But that's not enough for the twin transition. Long-term commitment is needed to work on, for example, this circularity. That's not something that can be realized in 4 years. Local government needs to be able to have the capacity to commit itself to work on these objectives for a period of 10 years or even longer. Um, Another aspect of this macro level is that governments need to be able to work with other governments. The sustainability transition is not something that ends at the border, so it is crucial for national governments to have this, what we call, connective capacity to work with other countries on reducing the CO2 emissions. Um, and another aspect of this macro level competencies are that governments need to have the legitimacy to work on these issues. They need to have the legitimacy to have agreements with other countries, but also to have long-term commitment. So politicians should accept at a certain stage that certain objectives have been formulated before they were elected, but they still need to commit to these objectives. Otherwise, these long-term commitments cannot be realized. So these are some of the challenges at the macro level. Um, at the meso level, you can think, for example, of having the organizational knowledge to connect the two. So what does it mean to set up a circular city? This means that within the organization, people need to be able to connect sustainability issues to digital issues. So that requires new forms of organizational knowledge. Um, it also means that organizations have to be able to work together. So for example, if we look at mobility as a service, then the Ministry of Infrastructure had to work with the national railways, with local bus companies, and with all kinds of other organizations to realize this system. Um, at the micro level, some of the issues are that civil servants need to be able to connect to knowledge domains that are very distinct. So they need to be able to translate, for example, what are information requests coming from a distributed energy system, so that ICT people are able to work on this. They also need the language and the motivation to work across boundaries and to work with people from very different domains. Um, so these are some of the huge challenges, and we brought this together in this overarching model, where we say, okay, at the institutional level, and I think I already mentioned these types of capacity. We need a policy capacity to have a long-term commitment. An example from the Netherlands is the Delta Commissioner. Um, that is a new position that was created to ensure that there's long-term commitment to protecting ourselves against the rising oceans. So that we all know that challenge will be coming. It will be coming in. We don't know how soon it will be coming, but we need to be prepared. It will not happen in 4 years, not in 8 years, but it will happen. So we created a new administrative form, the Delta Commissioner, to ensure this long-term commitment. An example of the legitimizing capacity is a citizen panel for am I still sharing my slides? Yeah.
We can see everything.
Yep,
yeah.
You can see the slides. Okay, good.
Perfect.
So the legitimizing capacities, for example, new forms of democracy, where in the Netherlands we'll have a citizen panel for climate change, which will help governments to have a long-term support from society, which sort of goes beyond the idea of the 4-year elections. And a global connective capacity is taking place within the European Union, but also broader in the COP that will take place soon in the Middle East. Organizational capacities are, for example, the strategic connections between different domains. So the city of Utrecht is really developing the capacity to connect their long-term information infrastructure planning to the requirements of the circular city. So this requires a new way of strategic thinking that's being developed in the city now. It also requires the capacity to work operationally across organizational boundaries. Again, the Ministry of Infrastructure had to develop the capacity to share data with all these other organizations. And the network capacity is also related to working together with other organizations. And the individual capacities are, for example, when civil servants in Utrecht and other cities are now being trained to be able to formulate information requirements coming from the sustainability transition. Um, the attitudinal capacity, as we call it, is also important. That's really about being willing and able to work across units and work with people coming from other domains to tackle this challenge. And the behavioral capacity is really making, for example, making the circular city work or making the energy transition work. So this is really a broad overview of a very broad range of capacities, but it also shows that we really need to invest in these government capacities at all these layers to be able to make the twin transition work. Our key argument here, it's a beautiful promise that it was formulated by the European Union, but to realize this promise, this requires a lot of hard work at the level of the national government, hard work at the level of organizations, and hard work at the individual level. So these types of capacities need to be built up in the coming years to be able to realize this twin transition. So we end our paper actually with a research agenda in which we highlight that we need to find forms to measure government capacities for the twin transition. We need to be able to measure to what extent national and local governments are really up to these new challenges, whether they've developed the capacities that are needed to make the twin transition work. The second question is about understanding the determinants of government capacities for the twin transition. We have to study which local or national governments have been able to build up these capacities and what was the key. Is it really about leadership? Is it about financial resources? Is it about creating political urgency? What can we do to sort of drive the buildup of these capacities? Um, the third one is assessing the impact of the capacities on the realization of the twin transitions. Which I mentioned several capacities, but which capacities are actually key to making this work? And how should they be formulated to really make this work? We need to get a better understanding of the relation between the capacities that are formulated and the actually realization of the twin transition. And finally, and probably most crucially, we need to develop ways for strengthening this government capacities. What can governments do that really want to be ready for the twin transition? What can they? What will be key interventions to strengthen their capacities? Do they need to center civil service to training programs? Do they need to invest in informing their politicians of the need to do this? Do they need to engage citizens to get broad societal support? So what are the interventions that are needed now to create these capacities that are needed to make the twin transition work? So it's not an easy task. A lot of things need to be done, but we think by sort of organizing this in these different layers and identifying different tasks, we can set a first step in strengthening these competences. So that's really the first part of my presentation. That's really about the instrumental part. What do governments need to do? The second part is more about sort of a critical assessment, and this is also work in progress. I hope this paper will be published soon in Information Polity. And in this paper, we actually start with identifying two limitations in the current focus in the research. And the first limitation is that there's a lot of attention for positive relations between e-governance and sustainability. That's also what the first part of this presentation was about, the idea that e-governance can really be a key component of making the sustainability transition work. Technology is a solution, but technology may also sometimes be a problem. And we have to be open to that. We have to realize that technology is not always a solution, but can sometimes be the problem. Um, and the second omission that we saw in current debates on the twin transition is that it's very much about instrumental usage of technology. Technology as a tool for policy, for making the energy transition work, or for making mobility as a service work. But as we know from the literature, technology is also a carrier of values and interests. I refer to classic work by Langdon Winner, who writes that artifacts do have politics. So it does really make a difference. He had a famous study of nuclear energy as not only being just another system of energy production, but a system of energy production that brings with it a concentration of power, new security risks, a certain perspective on what kind of waste production is acceptable. So these technologies are not value free. They're connected to interest, and we need to also uncover the value ladenness of these technologies. So with these two limitations, we developed this overview of different perspectives on the twin transition. And in the top right corner, you will see the instrumental perspective that I discussed in the first part of this presentation, the idea that e-governance is an instrument for realizing sustainable development. That's sometimes also called e-gov for sustainable development. So that's the dominant perspective. But on the top left-hand corner, you see the idea of green IT, or you could say gray or black IT, the idea that e-governance could actually result in a huge usage of energy. And we know that the data warehouses use a lot of energy, and the ChatGPT uses a lot of energy. So all these so-called useful instruments for the sustainability transition may actually generate their own problems and may actually contribute to the energy usage. Then if we go to the bottom left corner, we go to some of the institutional problems, and there what we call the machine logic of e-governance. The idea is that e-governance has some basic values and orientations in it that may actually be environmentally destructive. And what I would like to highlight here is the short-term orientation. E-governance solutions are often meant to work now, and they may cause problems in a couple of years, but we do not focus on that. We all know the problems with the legacy systems. These problems exist because there's no long-term orientation in e-governance, and that's also one of the key problems in related to sustainability. Um, and finally, the ecology logic of e-governance highlights that e-governance could also be environmentally constructive. But then we need to start thinking about e-governance in a very different way, in a sort of more ecological way, and I'll come back to that later. So let me go through these 4 cells quickly now, and then you will understand why we think current questions are not discussed currently when it comes to the twin transition, and how our research agenda and critical perspective can be strengthened. E-government for sustainability, for sustainable development, is really what I discussed in the first part. It's the idea that we need um, um, information infrastructures for the circular city, for mobility as a service, and for distributed electricity systems. What we observed here in the literature, that perverse effects and opportunity costs of e-government for sustainable development are largely ignored. There's very little attention for the fact that yeah, that e-government may actually not have the desired effects, or may actually compound the existing problems. Then when we come to green IT, we were surprised to find that there's actually hardly any literature on green e-governance. There is some literature on green IT in the private sector. Um, the idea that when organizations start using IT, they should not only look at the question whether it's whether the technology works well, whether it's open source technology, whether it's efficient, whether it's client friendly, but also whether it's sustainable, whether all the data that's being used, for example, for the client management system, or for using from some kind of form of algorithm, also generates energy costs. So there's a growing realization that IT by itself may actually use up a large percentage of the worldwide energy resources. But still, within government, this is only discussed to a very limited extent, and in the literature there's hardly any attention. We did find that in the UK, they did formulate the greening government ICT vision. So that's the idea that a cost-effective and energy-efficient ICT estate, which is fully exploited with reduced environmental impacts, to enable new and sustainable ways of working for the public sector. So in the UK, they've started to realize that. Some other governments have also started working on that, but there's still very, very little information and no literature on green e-governance. Then we go to what we call the machine logic. And a machine logic, that I already mentioned, that highlights that there may be sort of institutional causes of sustainability problems that are quite similar to institutional patterns in e-governance. And I already mentioned the short-term focus, and there's also the reductionist focus, both in our thinking about technology, but also the way we look at our environment. There's often a focus on efficiency and very limited attention for external effects, and also for relations between, for example, the environmental pollution, animal welfare, the protection of our nature reserves. They're often different domains in government and not connected in integrated policies. And that's what we also see in the way people think about technology and e-governance. So there is reductionism, what Morozov has called technological solutionism, the idea that the technology will always be a solution for all our problems. And we highlight that this may actually be quite dangerous. High faith in technology can form a barrier for sustainable transformation. And the example that I have from the Netherlands is where the Minister of Transport said, okay, we need to reduce our air travel for a couple of years, but then we'll have clean, silent airplanes, and then we can all fly to every location again. So there's no sense of urgency that we should fly less, no sense of urgency that we should invest in other forms of transport, because silent and clean air travel will bring us all the solutions. Well, this promise has existed for a long time. It has not been materialized yet, so it may even be dangerous because it can stop us from taking the measures that we need to take to protect our environment by having blind faith in technological solutions. Um, and then we come to the fourth cell, the ecology logic of e-governance. And this is, there's very little literature on this yet, but there are some key publications on information ecologies. Some of you may know the work by Nardi and O'Day on information ecologies of government, information ecologies. That's really a new way, which is less reductionist, takes more integrated approach, cherishes also the idea that information does not only exist in systems, but also in the heads of people, in connections between people. So it takes a richer approach to what information is and how it can contribute to societal progress. And this sort of ecological approach may be of may present a different way of looking at the twin transition. And one example from the Netherlands is this initiative called the sniffer bicycle. Um, the idea really here is that if we put a sensor on the bicycles of citizens that want to participate, they can ride their bicycles and collect all kinds of information about air quality. This information will become a common pool resource that can be reduced either by citizens to take difficult bicycle routes, by citizens to push for better air quality, by governments to improve their air quality policies, etc. So it sort of opens a way of thinking in information more as a common pool resource that will enable all kinds of forms of collective action that may enable us to realize the sustainability transition. So this may be a bit of a sort of a hopeful direction, but I'm very much very careful about this because this is still quite limited, whereas the machine logic of e-government is still very dominant. So where does this bring us? What questions are relevant if we think about the twin transition? Um, well, the first question is that the question that I addressed in the first part of my presentation: which government competences are required for the twin transition? That's a key question if we want to realize the instrumental value of the sustainability transition for of the digital transition for the sustainability transition. But we also need to look at green e-governance. There's very little research into green e-governance. We need to make sure that that the costs, the environmental costs that we're creating through the usage of technology is minimized. So more research is needed into how to do green e-governance. A third question is we need to be critical about the idea of e-governance as a solution for everything. And we need to also bring up the question, when does bringing in e-governance actually make the problem worse than providing a solution? And we need to also be open to the idea that we may not want technological solutions, but we need to look at more drastic changes to protect our planet. Um, and a final question that we identified on the basis of this analysis is: how can a logic of ecology form the basis for the twin transition? So this is a very, very fundamental question. I've given you the example of the sniffer bicycle. I mentioned the work by Nardi and O'Day. It's still a very initial stage, but I think we really need to rethink this fourth cell, because it can actually be a key to sort of connecting the sustainability transition and the digital transition in a good way and a more structural way than only looking at instrumental solutions. So I come to my conclusions. I would say there's a great societal need to generate an integrated understanding of the twin transition. I am really worried, I'm sure as most of you are, about the sustainability problems that we're facing right now. We really need to do something, and technology can be important. So we need to find ways to rethink how this digital transition can actually make a difference and can be connected to the sustainability transition in a good way. But we do not only need to do that from an instrumental perspective. we should not be naive about technology. We should acknowledge that technology sometimes is not a solution, but is a problem. And we should also acknowledge that a technological way of thinking may actually be a huge problem to realizing the sustainability transition. So we also need to think about the institutional aspects of technology. Um, we hope that with these two papers, we develop some conceptual insights that can really form the basis for the research that we need to do. It's really at the initial phase. I would really encourage many of you to also sort of connect to this work and also start focusing on it, because again, I think the urgency is very high. And yeah, I do hope that these sort of conceptual approaches will be helpful to advance your research. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing, and I'm very, very interested in hearing your questions and comments.